Good evening, everybody. I'd like to call this Thursday, June 8th, 2017 Sacramento Metro Fire Board meeting to order. If we can get a pledge to the flag, Director Jones. On Metro Cable 14, replay on Saturday, June 10th, 2017 at 12 noon and Sunday, June 11th, 2017 at 9 a.m. on Channel 14. Webcast at www.sacmetrocable.tv. The open session meetings are also available for viewing on the district website at www.metrofire.ca.gov. Right now, I'd like to offer a public opportunity to discuss matters of public interest within the district jurisdiction, including items that are on or not on the agenda. Madam Clerk, do we have any speakers?
There are no speakers this evening.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the consent items.
Mr. Chairman, if it pleases the group, I move the consent agenda.
Second. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any comments or questions prior to moving on? Thank you, Madam Clerk. Please.
Director Gale.
Yes.
Gould.
Aye.
Jones.
Aye.
Sheets.
Aye.
Clark.
Aye.
Kelly.
Aye.
And Barnes.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the action items, fiscal year 2016 Assistance to Firefighters Grant AFG Award. I believe it's Aaron Castleberry. Thank you very much.
Good evening, directors, fire chief, council, clerk. It's my pleasure to be here tonight to announce to the board that we have received notification of a fiscal year 16 Assistance to Firefighters Grant Award in the amount of $179,355 for the Advanced Bulk Storage Foam Training. So Chief Law is going to tell you a little more about that, but we applied for the grant in November and we were just notified of the award. The fiscal impact of that will be included in the preliminary budget. Metro Fire does have a match of $16,305, with the federal portion being $163,050. And Chief Law can tell you a little more about what that grant is going to be used for.
Good evening, Chief Arms Directors. I'm going to give you some brief history on our grant request and the school that we're going to be able to send our firefighters to. So as part of our threat assessment when we were doing the emergency operations plan review back in 2015, I believe, we identified that there are approximately 100 facilities within the district's jurisdictional boundaries that store 10,000 gallons or more of flammable and combustible liquids. The largest storage tanks within our jurisdiction are found at the Kinder Morgan Bradshaw terminal, which is at Bradshaw and Folsom, if the directors are aware of that area. We also have tank farms at McClellan Jet Service Tank Farm and at Mather Airport still. So in the event of any type of major release or fire, these facilities could potentially pose a threat to residential neighborhoods, business parks, critical infrastructure such as rail lines along Folsom Boulevard, as well as highways, obviously airports here at Mather and Union Pacific and Light Rail. So, as you can see here, we've got the Bradshaw Tank Farm. It's got large storage tanks. There's about 18 of those on site, and as you can see off in the distance, we have a lot of build-out close up to that facility. This is just an example of one of the facilities within our jurisdiction. So in the fourth quarter of 2015, Metro Fire began efforts to address the growing risk of a large-scale flammable or combustible liquid release or fire. The existing foam unit that was at Fire Station 62 was retrofitted and moved to Station 31 to provide better access to major thoroughfares both north and south of the river. And along with that, Metro identified a dedicated foam operations team, which currently consists of 7 fire captains, 3 engineers, and 3 firefighters. At this time, the team identified a need to train additional engineers and firefighters to backfill in the event of any injuries, illness, vacation leave, those type of issues. With that in mind, the team began training with the goal of reaching a standard consistent with NFPA 11 and NFPA 472, which are standards for low, medium, and high expansion foam, and the standard for competence of responders when dealing with hazardous materials and weapons of mass destruction incidents. As part of this process, the team identified that we're unable to participate in any live fire training that includes the application of Class B foam, which would be needed to mitigate fire with flammable liquids. There's a lack of specialty schools in California where we'd be allowed to flow the foam. In addition, there's insufficient funds for us to be able to send our crews out of state to achieve that training. So with that in mind, we applied for a grant in the 2016 AFG grant cycle in order to send the foam team, which would be 7 captains, 6 engineers, and 6 firefighters, to Texas A&M Engineering Extension Service. It's commonly known as TEEX. TEEX operates a comprehensive emergency preparedness campus in College Station, Texas, which consists of the Brayton Fire Training Field, a Disaster City, and Emergency Operations Training Center. Most recently, we have been able to send some firefighters through the assistance of Union Pacific and BNSF Railways for crude by rail training at Texas A&M, and now we're going to be able to do the advanced bulk storage training as well. So the crews are going to be going to Brayton Fire Training Field, which is the largest liquid-fueled live fire training facility in the world. They train firefighters from all 50 states, as well as I believe there are up to 81 different companies or countries that have come to Texas for training. They have industrial complexes, marine freighter section, full-scale aircraft, hazardous materials, and rescue training as well. And if this will work, have a little video to show you briefly of what type of training the crews are going to be able to attend here. And this video was from a Spanish Fire Brigade that went to the advanced bulk storage training. So you see the training they're going to be able to attend is a pretty good simulation of what they might experience out in the field, and they will have the opportunity to actually flow foam at the training. So they're starting to flow the foam here. They're going to be able to practice proper application techniques in order to not waste the foam that we do have on hand. So that's just an example, and my presentation vanished. Just trying to go on to the next slide. It took me out of the presentation. Sorry, technical difficulties. There we go. So we're good there. I just got to go to the next slide. Oh, alrighty. Apologize. So the TEEX bulk storage project is what this training is referred to. It consists of 2 25-foot diameter tanks, which have a floating roof tank with a burning roof seal prop, as well as a fully involved open top tank that can simulate a full surface fire, as well as flange leaks at the base of the tank, and that can be used to simulate burning fuel spills. The topics of instruction that the crews will be attending is going to include tank identification and transport, predicting the behavior of tanks and their contents under fire. They're going to be using actual firefighting foams at different percentages, as well as calculating the water supplies necessary for a large fire attack of this type. And they're going to be discussing strategy and tactics, and then implementing a response plan. Over the 3 days of the class, the crews will have multiple opportunities to use their knowledge and skills on realistic scale props that are actually in a controlled environment, but as you can see, hopefully you can see, realistic. So the benefits to the district of being able to send firefighters out of state to get this training is that the foam that we have right now is a limited resource in Sacramento County, and we are actually a regional asset. We do have mutual aid agreements with all of the fire departments in the area. So in the event that there was a problem anywhere within the region, Metro Fire's foam team would be expected to respond. Mutual aid resources can take up to an hour, so it's important for the crews to be familiar with the calculations and different techniques to use so that they don't waste the foam that we do have. If we mount a foam attack too early without having the right calculations done and the right resources on hand, we're going to waste what we have and potentially have a larger problem. So the proper application of foam at the right time is imperative to mitigate the incidents in a safe and timely manner, which is going to reduce the impacts to our community and the health and environment and financial impact on the community. So that's a brief overview of the training we're going to be able to attend thanks to this grant, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Chief Law. Any comments? Dr. Kelly.
In addition to the hazards that the tank farms pose in our Metro Fire's jurisdiction, will this not also help us in dealing with fuel oil by rail incidents? And then my other question was, how many of those other jurisdictions that we have mutual aid agreements with also have foam response programs?
Director, or not director, Chief Bridge isn't here.
Okay.
Chief Johnson, do you know? I know Rockland Fire has a foam unit at this time. City of Sacramento, I believe that's gone over to West Sacramento, is handling that at time. West Sac, Rockland, the airport, Sacramento County Airports does have some resources as well. Okay. So,
Thank you.
and then as far as the applicability to other settings, yes, the training would apply. They are going to be learning techniques for calculating foam percentages and the best method of application to use, which could be used in transportation as well as crude by rail. I was able to go to crude by rail myself last year, and just the experience of being able to experience the heat and seeing what's going to happen on the tank and how you can tell when that's been cooled enough and how much water to use was invaluable. It was one of the best classes I've ever actually attended in my career. So I'm excited that our firefighters are going to be able to go and experience this as well. I think it's going to build their confidence before we ever actually have an incident, which hopefully we don't, but we're going to be prepared in the event that we do.
Thank you. Director Gould.
Chief Law, thank you very much for that. Question I have, it sounds like the foam is kind of a hard item or product to come by. Is that in fact the case?
I don't believe it's hard to come by. It's just that it is a costly resource to keep on hand. It does have expiration dates. It needs to be inspected, and there's charges, costs associated with that, which is why they're a shared resource.
I'm just wondering if there's a way that after these folks get this training, we can look at strategically placing some of that around, because my concern is we do all this training. If we don't have enough foam in the right spot, it could be a very long time before the foam and the folks get to the incident. And I'm wondering if just we could have foam stored places and engine companies bring foam to the team if that's a more timely strategy. So it sounded almost like the foam was pretty hard to come by.
Well, there are foam caches throughout the region. Okay. For example, Kinder Morgan has several totes of foam on site. What we have is, in addition to all of the high hazard facilities typically have foam resources on site. This is more will help us with the transportation type fires, like the event they had down south last week. I'm not sure if you saw in the news the tanker car that turned over and exploded. So those, we're not going to have foam there, so we'll be able to get foam 31 out there. And
will this training that happens at College Station, is it more along the lines of a train the trainer, so that the men and women that come back will have an opportunity to do some training of our non-team folks so that they're up to speed on some of the issues?
Yes, they will be able to come back and bring some of the techniques. What they won't be able to do here is actually train with foam. We don't have anywhere regionally currently that we could actually apply foam. Even going to Kinder Morgan and just practicing with the equipment out there, they have to pull permits for us even to flow water out into the field next.
Yeah.
So
I
there's
would imagine
EPA
it's a little different
considerations
between
and
Texas
others.
and California.
Yeah, yeah.
Saying,
Regulations.
I saw a really big black smoke, and I'm not sure they like that here in this state.
No.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Chair.
Thank you,
Mr.
Director Gill.
President,
Director Gill.
question. At one time, we had that facility out at the base here in Sacramento, and I'm sure the Strategic Accommodation had one here on Mather.
There is still a tank farm on Mather. It was recently relocated, and it's used more for the aviation fuel now, not the military application that it had before. That was a Caltrans project over the last couple of years to relocate tanks for that.
But it was at one time. Yeah, okay.
Well, I hope the citizens of our region understand the threat assessment and the forward thinking that Metro Fire is doing. As we say in our region, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when it's going to happen, and to have that available and be prepared. I commend all of you for that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to fiscal year.
I'm
sorry. Go
It's an
ahead,
action item. Does this
Oh.
require us to
Yeah.
accept the grant? So I make a motion, we do such.
And I'll second.
You have a motion and a second. Thank you. Told you it's the wrong day.
Director Gale.
Yes.
Gould.
Aye.
Jones.
Aye.
Sheets.
Aye.
Clark.
Aye.
Kelly.
Aye.
And Barnes.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And for the record, the clerk had it written note here for an action item, so I apologize for overlooking that as well. Moving on to the second item, fiscal year 17-18 preliminary budget. Ms. Thomas.
Good evening, directors. Actually, I think to get us started off this evening, Chief Harms wanted to make a few comments.
Thank you, Amanda. Directors, we've got the preliminary budget for fiscal year 17 and 18 that we will present to you. We started off in the process with quite the funding gaps of what we would like to be able to fund and what we were able to fund. We sat down with all of the managers and a lot of members in the district, and along with 522, and went through the budget process over the last few months. And then at the end, sat down really with 522 and the exec staff and came up with the budget that we're presenting to you. The 17-18 budget is roughly $195 million in revenue with about $196 million in expenses. That will tap into $1 million of reserves, and that's mostly for a one-time expense, and it's for the first floor and the tenant improvements for that first floor, in which Amanda will talk about. Property tax revenue for 17-18 is expected to be up about 5%. After that, as we talked a few weeks ago, we're looking at about 4%, but that 5% results in about a $7 million in additional funding that will come forward. The budget also assumes, as we move forward, as we look at some other revenue streams and our ability to look at those and make sure that we do adjustments for the cost that they have for us, and especially in medic revenue. The biggest growth that we have in this budget this year is the labor budget. It's pretty close to the revenue, and it's mostly related to salary increases under the current contract. And if you look at the higher pension costs that we will start to assume and we talked about over the next few years. So I will turn it over to Amanda, and if you have any questions, then at the end we can talk about the preliminary budget.
Great, thank you. And I actually did want to start off really by thanking everyone that was involved in that process that Chief Harms described. I mean, it really takes people across the entire district, managers and staffs in the divisions, providing input and participating in the process. I wanted to thank Chief Harms and the entire command staff for their leadership and the decision-making that needed to happen as we moved through the process so that we could get to a point where we're able to recommend a budget that has our expenses and revenues fairly closely aligned. And then finally, last but not least, I wanted to thank the staff in the finance division who does all the behind-the-scenes stuff that really makes this happen. I did also, before I jump into the presentation, want to mention that the preliminary budget for 17-18 was presented to the Finance and Audit Committee on May 24th. And then the only change that's reflected in the current budget versus what was presented to the Finance and Audit Committee is the addition of the grant that you just approved. So I'm glad you approved that. Otherwise, this would have been awkward. Otherwise, the budget is unchanged from what was presented at that meeting. Okay, so just to start off, I always think it's kind of helpful to look at the history of where we've been in terms of the revenues that are available to fund expenses in the general fund. And as Chief Harms mentioned, we're looking at a revenue budget for 17-18 of roughly $195 million, so you can see that all the way off to the right-hand side there. If you look at that $195 million and where we think we're going to be in 17-18 and kind of compare that to really the low point that we experienced during the recession in 2010-11, it's about a $50 million increase in the annual amount of funding available. So I think you can see that we've come a long way since then. Over that period of time, about half of that $50 million, about half of that increase is coming from increased property tax revenues, and about half of it is coming from increases in other revenue sources, largely our medic cost recovery and our participation in both the GEMT and the IGT programs that give us some supplemental federal funding associated with our transports. So that's kind of the history of where we were and where we are now. Looking specifically at those property tax revenues, in this current year, fiscal year 16-17, we're returning to our kind of pre-recession high of property tax revenues, actually surpassing that a little bit. And again, as Chief Harms mentioned, we're expecting an additional $7 million in property tax revenues in 17-18 to get us to a total of $138 million out of that $195 million in total revenues. Okay, so this chart really presents all of the funds for which we're recommending budgeted expenditures. My presentation is going to focus on the general fund because, as you can see, that's where the majority of our revenue and expense is. But you can see here really the revenues, expenses, transfers, and then the projected beginning and ending fund balances for all of the funds for which we have a budget. As I said, I'll focus on the general fund. I'll also talk in a little bit more detail about the capital facilities fund, the leased properties fund, and the grants fund. And then kind of continuing to look over to the right there, the development impact fees fund, I'm really not going to address after this slide, but do want to point out that we have that fund. It exists to account for the revenue and expenses associated with the impact fees that developers pay. Those fees, the revenues from those fees can only be used to fund new stations or new equipment associated with mitigating the impacts of new development. So we're not really planning for a lot of expenditures out of that fund, but we will continue to collect those impact fees, and they will be available at such time that we need to build new fire stations associated with new development. And then looking over to the right again, the last fund that we're showing a budget for is the IGT fund. So IGT is intergovernmental transfers. I think that's a program that we participate in that allows us to receive additional federal funding associated with the transports that we provide to Medi-Cal beneficiaries, and these are the managed care Medi-Cal beneficiaries. One thing that I want to point out about the IGT fund budget that we're recommending for fiscal year 17-18 is that we actually expect to have 2 years worth of IGT happening in 17-18. So normally we would only have one 12-month period that we're covering additional revenue for within a budget year. Because of the timing of the way the state is planning to do things, we're actually going to recover for both fiscal year 15-16 and 16-17 in the 17-18 year. So we will have essentially 2 years worth showing up in 1 year. And the way that we're showing this from a budget standpoint, because normally that second year we would expect to have as a funding source in 18-19, we're only using the net revenue from that first year to fund expenses in 17-18. So we would retain, and if you look all the way down to the bottom, you can see at the end of the year we expect there to be about $5.8 million sitting in this fund. That would be available in our fiscal year 18-19 budget. That's roughly the annual amount that we have. So there's about that amount that's being transferred out in 17-18. The same amount, which it represents the second year, would remain in the fund at the end of 17-18 and be available for general fund expenses in 18-19. So I kind of wanted to explain the mechanics of that. And the way that this works is that we need to send money to the state, and then that there's an administrative fee that's retained by the state, and then the matching funds come in from the federal government. So what you're seeing at the very top line is $29.8 million in revenue that's coming in. But I want to point out, if you look right below that, there's $18.3 million that we're sending out to get that. So the net revenue that's being received is that $11.5 million. Roughly half of that will be allocated to 17-18 expenditures, and roughly half of it would be reserved for 18-19. So that's kind of the mechanics of how the IGT fund is working. If you look over to the right, you see that we have a total column. But given some of the things that we've already talked about and some of the things that I will talk about, really that total revenue of $227 million is not available for general fund expenditures. That's the total across all of our funds. Many of those revenue sources are restricted in their use or identified for other uses within those funds. So when we think about what's actually available for general fund expenditures, it's that general fund revenue that's circled up at the top there, and the net transfer that's coming in from the IGT fund, and it's the sum of those two numbers. That's the $195 million that I talked about on the previous slide. So those are really the numbers to think about in terms of how much is available to fund our general operating expenses. When we look at what's available to fund those expenses versus what those expenses are and the amount that needs to be transferred out of the general fund into other funds, that's where we're left with this roughly $1.3 million use of general fund reserves. And you see when we start with a beginning balance in the general fund of about $21.4 million in reserves and deduct that amount, we project to end the year with roughly $20.2 million in reserves in the general fund. So looking a little bit more closely at the general fund and the changes in the general fund budget from year to year, the first column here is showing us the current budget for fiscal year 16-17, the year we're in right now. And then the next column over is the preliminary budget that we're recommending for 17-18. And then the third column is really just showing the variance between those two. So looking at the top line number, the actual general fund revenue, you can see we're going from about $182 million this year to about $189 million next year, about a $7 million increase year to year in general fund revenues. Looking at the total expenditures line, we're going from general fund expenditures of about $184 million this year to about $192 million next year, or about an $8 million increase in total general fund expenditures. So the expenses within the general fund have grown a little bit faster than the revenues, or by about $1 million. However, that's offset by some of the transfer activity that we see down below. So if you look at the transfers in and out, the first one I want to talk about is the transfer that goes out to the Capital Facilities Fund. So that's the second row under transfers, Fund D, Capital Facilities Fund. You can see that in the current year, we have about $4.9 million in funding needs in the Capital Facilities Fund that's met with a transfer from the general fund. That's actually being reduced next year to about $3.6 million. So that's sort of a $1.4 million use of general fund resources that's being freed up there. We also have small transfer activity in the grants fund. If you look down to the Fund L leases, this is something that Chief Harms alluded to, and I'll talk about more in my presentation, but you can see that there is a required transfer from the general fund to the leased properties fund of a little under $700,000. So that's really representing some upfront one-time expenses and is resulting in a use of general fund reserves for for that purpose, and I'll talk a little bit more about those assumptions later on. Right underneath that, we have that transfer that's coming in from the IGT fund that's helping to offset general fund expenditures. So overall, there's a net $1.5 million that's coming into the general fund. That's about a $500,000 improvement compared to this current year. And then you can see we're ending up with that net use of general fund reserves of about $1.3 million, a little over half of which is resulting from that transfer out to the L fund. So looking at our general fund revenue, as I mentioned, this is a total of about $189 million. And as you can see on that first chart that we looked at, and the majority of that is coming from property taxes. So 72.9%, or about $138 million, is coming from property tax revenue. Of our other revenue sources, our medic cost recovery represents the largest share at 19.3%, and that's about $36 million. So again, looking at that $189 million overall, that's a $6.7 million increase compared to fiscal year 16-17. Property taxes alone are an increase of $6.8 million year to year, and that's about a 5% increase. We're also showing an additional $3.1 million in medic cost recovery revenue. There are two key assumptions that are resulting in that increase year to year. One is the assumption of having more months of district billed units resulting from the contract that we have for service. So we had 7 months of that in 16-17, and we're assuming 12 months in 17-18. And then the other key assumption, as again Chief Harms mentioned, is that we're looking at increasing the fees to provide that service based on recovering our cost associated with providing it. So that's resulting in additional assumed revenue as well. You can see that we have about $400,000 in contract service revenue, which again is associated with additional cost recovery for services provided under contract. And then the big change when we compare a mid-year budget, which is what we have for 16-17, to a preliminary budget, which is what we're showing for 17-18, is that we don't budget for either the expenses or the revenues associated with the deployment labor, the direct labor. So we have a $3.8 million decrease in revenue just because we're comparing a mid-year to a preliminary budget, but you'll see that we also have a similar decrease on the labor expense side, so that those things effectively balance each other out. When we adjust for that difference and have a more apples-to-apples comparison, the net increase in general fund revenue year to year is about $10.5 million. Our net IGT revenue really gets added to that. So the $189 million general fund revenue, we add $5.8 million to that in the net IGT revenue. And that's roughly the same year to year. It's actually a slight $100,000 decrease compared to fiscal year 16-17. So turning to look at our expenses, we have total expenditures in the general fund of $192 million. You can see that 85.7% of that is labor, 12.7% services and supplies, and then a much smaller amount, 1.6%, taxes, licenses, debt service, and assessments. Looking at the labor budget in the general fund, it's a $164 million labor budget for fiscal year 17-18. That's a $6.7 million increase compared to fiscal year 16-17. When we make that same adjustment here for those deployment expenses, the apples-to-apples comparison is a $9.9 million, 6.4% increase year to year. Some of the major changes from 16-17 to 17-18, the two largest factors contributing to the increase are the salary increases under the MOU, and then increased payments related to our unfunded pension liability. So those are the two biggest factors, but we also have smaller increases that are resulting from assumed increases in medical premiums. So those adjust every January. When we do the final budget, we'll actually know what those are and have better numbers there, but we have some assumptions about increases there. We have increased holiday pay really due to the timing of payments. We had a kind of an abnormally low year in 16-17 and are expecting that to normalize in 17-18. 17-18. And then we have costs associated with assuming that we have additional filled positions and a much smaller amount from new positions. I do want to mention that the filling of the additional positions, that cost, comes with a reduction on the overtime side. So if we assume we have additional filled line positions, then we have reduced overtime, reduced callback overtime, and we're seeing that in the budget. We're budgeting for about a 24% reduction in the callback overtime from year to year. Looking at general fund services and supplies, the total budget here is $24.3 million. That's about $1 million increase compared to 16-17. Most of that is resulting from the assumption of 12 months of ambulance service contract versus 7 months in the existing 16-17 budget. We have smaller increases resulting from increases in training, building services, fuel, and safety clothing and supplies. Those are largely offset by some reductions that we have as a result of having one-time expenditures for equipment and election services in 16-17 that we don't have in 17-18. And then finally, the smallest category of expenses, debt service assessments and contributions, totals $3.1 million. This is essentially unchanged from 16-17. The largest component of that is the $1.8 million assessment paid to the county for collection and administration of our property taxes. It also includes general fund debt service, and you can see those amounts listed below. And then finally, after we look at the revenues and expenses, and we talked about this on the table, but we have the transfers that are coming into and going out of the general fund. Overall net, there's $1.5 million that's coming into the general fund. That's $3.6 million. It's going out to the capital facilities fund. As I mentioned, this is a decrease from 16-17 to 17-18. And I'll talk a little bit about what the revenues and expenses are in that fund that are resulting in that. But this is the net impact to the general fund. Also, about $700,000 that's going out to the leased properties fund. We talked about that a little bit, and I also discussed that fund in detail in a few slides. And then finally, we have that $5.8 million transfer that's coming in from the IGT fund, as we already discussed. So looking at the capital facilities fund and focusing on that middle column, which is the recommended budget for 17-18, you can see that we're showing total revenues of just under $4.9 million, with most of that being financing proceeds, so $4 million in financing proceeds, and about $800,000 that we're assuming from the sale of property. If you look at our expenditures, that total expenditures line, you can see that we're showing in 17-18 total expenditures of $8.4 million. And that is a combination of about $4.2 million in capital outlay and roughly the same amount, $4.2 million in debt service. If you compare the capital outlay number to the financing proceeds number, you can see that most of what we're anticipating purchasing in terms of capital outlay will be financed. So those two are roughly offsetting each other. And we're ending up with a revenues less expenditure number of $3.6 million, which is what needs to come from the general fund. And that's effectively funding debt service and any capital outlay that isn't financed. So just to kind of talk about that a little bit more, that net $3.6 million coming from the general fund is resulting from $4.2 million in capital outlay, offset by that $4.1 million in financing proceeds. We have a $4.2 million debt service requirement, which is an increase from 16-17 as a result of purchases that were made in 16-17 and then an additional $400,000 resulting from purchases that would be made in 17-18. We have some revenue of about $800,000 that we're assuming from the sale of property that's offsetting what needs to come from the general fund, but all of that together is resulting in that $3.6 million funding need. For the $4.2 million in capital outlay, some of the major purchases that are included in that, and that says 16-17, it should say 17-18, I apologize, we have a hazmat truck for $1 million, 3 ambulances for $600,000, 3 Type 6 engines for $600,000, and then air rig for $600,000. So those are the major purchases that are included in that $4.2 million. So turning to look at the grant fund, the grant fund for 17-18 is budgeting for the revenues and expenses associated with 3 grants. So the one that was presented this evening, the SAFER grant, which is a continuation of a grant that funds 9 firefighter positions, and then we also have $170,000 for training props at the Zinfandel training site. So what you're seeing here is the total revenue and expenses for those 3 grants. You can see that when you compare the grant revenue to the grant expenses, what we're left with is $16,305, which represents the district match for the grant that was approved this evening, and that would be coming as a transfer in from the general fund to the grants fund to fund that required district match. Otherwise, the other expenditures associated with that grant and 100% of the expenditures on the other 2 grants are funded with the grant revenue. And finally, the last fund that we'll discuss is the leased properties fund. And the major assumption for the preliminary budget for 17-18 for this fund is that we would lease the first floor of this building during 17-18. That would include the resumption of lease revenue for that property, but it also would result in an upfront cost associated with tenant improvements that we would recover over the life of the lease. So I do want to stress that both on the revenue and the cost side, what are included here are assumptions because we don't know what that lease would end up looking like. But these are reasonable assumptions for what might occur. So when you look at total revenue in this fund, and this represents all leased properties in the district, but the first floor of this building is really the major leased property resulting in the majority of the revenue and the expenses. So when you look at total revenue, you can see that we have an increase that we're showing, going from a little over $700,000 to a little under $900,000 year to year. But the big change is on the expenditure side. So looking at expenditures, we have about a $2.3 million total expenditure budget for this fund, which is about $1.5 million increase year to year. And that is really resulting entirely from an assumption about tenant improvements that would need to be made. You can see comparing revenues to expenses, there's $1.4 million more in expenses than revenues. And the way that would be funded is that essentially half of it, or a little bit more than half of it, would be funded from existing reserves in the leased properties fund. And that would deplete the reserves in that fund. And then the remainder would come from the general fund and effectively would be a use of general fund reserves. So that's that about $700,000 transfer that I mentioned earlier. So that really concludes the discussion of the recommended fund budgets. Just to summarize, I wanted to talk a little bit about reserves. I mentioned that with this recommended budget, we would be ending with a $20.2 million general fund reserves. That's after about a $1.3 million use of reserves during the year. That would represent 10.4% of net budgeted expenditures. And then really looking beyond 17-18, just wanted to talk about, aligning future costs and revenue growth, because that's going to be something that we're looking at in terms of ensuring financial sustainability, not only looking at this year, but what are the challenges that we have facing us in future years. And I know we touched on this at the board workshop. Those challenges really for us are going to include pension costs, both as a result of escalating payments due to the unfunded liability compounded with investment return assumptions that CalPERS has made. We also know that capital replacement and maintenance needs, we have probably over $25 million over the next 5 years that will need to be funded. So that's going to be a challenge from a budgetary standpoint. And then finally, we talked about the IGT program tonight. The future of that program really is dependent on what happens with federal legislation and regulation. And any reduction or potential elimination of that program would have significant budgetary consequences for us. So that's something also that we've identified as a challenge. These really are all challenges that we will be working to address. You can expect to be hearing more about these things as we move through the budget process this year, and certainly as we get into future year budgets. And that really is all toward the goal of making sure that we are aligning those expenses and revenues and doing that in a financially sustainable way. So that really concludes my presentation. Our recommendation this evening is adoption of the preliminary budget for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2018. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. Appreciate any comments, questions from the board? Director Jones. No.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, CFO Amanda. It seems like, okay, you answered, I think, one of the three questions that I had with the subsequent slides. In the beginning, on the earlier slides, where we had the general fund, we had the list of revenues and expenditures, and off to the right, it was like the fourth or fifth one was IGT, and it was an $18+ million figure. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
This
You're
slide?
fast. That's
okay.
Great. Now, does that include two, because you're saying the revenue included 16, 17, and 17, 18. Is that correct?
Yes. So what you're seeing both for the revenue and expenditure on the IGT is really reflecting 2 years of activity.
All righty. So that 18 number includes the payment for next year, the extra amount, the seed money we have to pay.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And then the number at the top also includes the revenue associated with that second year.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that payment was included in the 18.
Correct.
So
yes.
that's good. And along these lines, just to make sure in our pie picture, you don't need to scroll, it's okay, just to make sure that the IGT is separate. It's not included in that medic cost or revenue, just to make sure.
That is correct, because that pie chart actually just includes actual general fund revenue, and we don't treat the IGT as general fund revenue.
Just
yes.
for clarification,
Yep.
Thank you. And then finally, if this is too much in the weeds, I can take an answer later. But I noticed that we had the reduction in the Fund D capital facilities to help balance that budget. Were there a lot of things or a couple big things that we are delaying doing? What are we not doing to have reduced that final number?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer that in a couple of ways. I mean, I think that the first is that we do have a reduction, and that's resulting from the fact that we're not anticipating as much in capital outlay next year as we are spending this year. Although I will say that what we're spending this year, part of that was an intentional use of spending reserves that we had thought we were going to be spent last year and weren't. And so when we got to the final and mid-year budget processes this year, it was an intentional, okay, well, we know that we're behind in our capital replacement. If we had already anticipated spending these reserves, why not use them now to buy equipment that we need? So I think part of what you're seeing is that this current year, 16-17, is higher than it would have been for that reason. But I will also say that certainly that there were things that were originally submitted and requested in the 17-18 budget process that we really couldn't accommodate. And I think that is going to be one of our challenges going forward. That was highlighted as one of the three things where we have more of a need for capital replacement than we have funding available. So it is a matter of prioritization. I think typically what we're seeing is it's not that we're not going to buy it. It's just that we're not going to buy it this year. We're going to buy it next year instead of this year. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you. All three of them. Thank you.
Okay.
Director Gould.
I have a quick question about the development impact fee. One of the concerns, because I know it's been around for a long time, and I know there's very strict guidelines of how that can be spent. Mm-hmm. My challenge is when we buy, for instance, a truck, that's an asset that's utilized around the district, and I'm just wondering what the restrictions are of why we can't tap into that development fund when we purchase an item that has an impact to new areas that have been taxed and so on and so forth. And I'm just wondering the restriction, because that fund sits there and grows, albeit slowly in the last few years, but it seems to me like it's become so restrictive that we can't spend it. And at times when we need to do that, it seems like we can't tap into that fund very easily. What's your thoughts?
So really the intent of the fee and the purpose of the fee is to the extent that new development is requiring us to buy equipment or to build a fire station, to incur capital expenditures. We have to do that because there's new development that needs to be served. That's how this money can be spent. So if we can, demonstrate that that's the case, I think that satisfies a requirement for how the money needs to be spent. I would say, though, that looking forward to, what we think the needs will be, and these are long time horizons, right? 10, 20, years that we're looking at before substantial amounts of this would need to get spent. I think that we would want to ensure that the funding is available then when it is needed. So I would be hesitant to spend it today, if it would not then leave us with a sufficient amount available to address those larger needs when they're coming in the future.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? I just had a couple things. The 24% reduction in overtime callback. Congratulations on everybody coming up with a plan to do that. I know it may not be popular in some arenas, the ones who are recipients of that, but as we know, the wear and tear on the personnel when they have to come back and the damages that can cause long term, not only to the firefighter but the family. So great job on that. You talked about the IGT, and I guess it's mentioned a couple times. We're kind of getting two payments in this cycle. With that, because the 1.3 cost for the improvements downstairs, it's a large number. But if we're having that extra IGT revenue, that's going into the general fund, correct? On top of that, because we're getting some right away, and then there's going to be enough that's going to go back into that general fund.
Yeah, so what we're recommending in terms of what the budget for 17-18 would show is that we actually that second year amount, but really for two reasons. One being it's anticipated to happen later in the year, and there's a potential that it may not happen in 17-18. I mean, at this point, our best information is that it will, but it's because it's toward the end of the year, there's a possibility that it won't. But more importantly, because that's the amount that normally would be available to fund 18-19 expenditures, we're not showing it in the general fund in 17-18. We're going to wait until 18-19 to reflect that money in the general fund.
Very good. Thank you very much. That's all I had. Anybody else?
I got a question.
Director Gale.
Do we need to really get crazy about a budget? For what reason? Because a budget is just a budget. You can always make changes to a budget. And the biggest thing in any business of financing is income and expense. It's a matter of controlling those. And there are certain rules. Back to development. How far out can we project for development? How many years out to be with a confidence level on it? When you talk 20 or 30 years, that's impossible. You could be Alexander Hamilton if you want to, and you wouldn't be able to solve that. I think you did a great job on it with the numbers and the funds you have.
Thank you. I mean, I do think that the point you raise is an important one, which is that we always get more information. So this is our preliminary budget. I'll be back here in September talking to you about the final budget, and I'll be back here in March talking to you about the mid-year budget. So even as we move through this year, we're going to get more information and refine our budget, and then we'll always be looking at what do we think is going to happen over the next 5 years. Obviously, we don't know that with certainty, but we have some idea of what that's going to be, and continuing to refine that as we move forward into those years.
Reserve that, even whatever reserve we have decided on, this is the amount we're going to have for special reasons or whatever, extenuating circumstances, that can also be changed.
Certainly.
Of course.
That is correct. And the reason why, as you mentioned, Director Gill, that we do get crazy about the budgets, the transparency, assumptions, and projections, and that's what keeps us out of these downturn and down years. So that's great by what we do, and that's what we're forward thinking. So I appreciate what you do. The team, I know it does take a team to do that. So that report out, truly appreciated by everybody and everybody's efforts involved. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I do see that this is an action item, and we have to do each one, I believe. That's correct.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chair, if you please.
think you're really good.
All right.
Dave's really good.
Is that going to be all right? We'll
Yes. Oh.
proceed. I would like to move approval of 2A Resolution 2017-18 Preliminary Budget for the General Operating Fund 212A.
Second?
Okay, motion and a second. Madam Clerk?
Director Gale,
Yes.
Gould,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Sheets,
Aye.
Clark,
Aye.
Kelly,
Aye.
and Barnes.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you.
All right. Mr. Chair, I'd like to move 2B Resolution for 2017-18 Preliminary Budget for the Capital Facilities Fund 212D.
Second.
Okay. So moved and a second. Madam Clerk?
Director Gale,
Yes.
Gould,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Sheets,
Aye.
Clark,
Aye.
Kelly,
Aye.
and Barnes.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to move 2C Resolution 2017-18 Preliminary Budget for Grants Fund 212G.
We have a
Second.
motion. Okay, motion and a second. Madam Clerk?
Director Gale,
Yes.
Gould,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Sheets,
Aye.
Clark,
Aye.
Kelly,
Aye.
and Barnes.
Aye.
Motion passes.
All right, then. Mr. Chair, if you please, 2D Resolution 2017-18 Preliminary Budget for Development Impact Fees Fund 212I.
I
Second?
have a motion and a second. Madam Clerk?
Director Gale,
Yes.
Gould,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Sheets,
Aye.
Clark,
Aye.
Kelly,
Aye.
and Barnes.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd move 2E Resolution 2017-18 Preliminary Budget for the Leased Properties Fund 212L.
Second?
I have a motion and a second. Madam Clerk, please.
Director Gale,
Yes.
Gould,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Sheets,
Aye.
Clark,
Aye.
Kelly,
Aye.
and Barnes.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you, and Mr. Chair, I'd like to move 2F Resolution 2017-18 Preliminary Budget for the IGT Fund 212M.
Second?
Motion and a second. Madam Clerk?
Director Gale,
Yes.
Gould,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Sheets,
Aye.
Clark,
Aye.
Kelly,
Aye.
and Barnes.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you very much.
You know,
Thank you,
I
Director.
have to say, I find it extremely unfair. There's not a Jennifer grant, or there's not a Jennifer fund, or a Jim fund, but there's a grant fund.
Let's see how that works.
Hurts, don't it?
Okay, moving on to action item number 3, disclosure of material expenditure, excess workers' compensation insurance. Chief Harms and Wells Fargo Representative Brad, and I apologize for the last name, sir.
Yeah. Try that.
Thank you.
Am I following your lead? No.
Go ahead.
All right.
Thank you.
Welcome, too, by the way.
Thank you.
And for 2 additional, thank you. Brad Svenningson, Wells Fargo Insurance. I'll just recap. You have about 7 policies that renew July 1. Overall, 2.5% increase equates to about $24,000 over last year. The 2 items that I'm here to speak about, the first is excess workers' comp, and that was a 10% decrease over last year, which was about $47,000 in savings. With the incumbent carrier, we did have another quote with New York Magic, which was an additional $59,000 in savings, but they have some limitations on their policy, and we chose to discuss that and stay with Safety National. I don't know if you have any other questions on that for me.
I do not. Any questions, Chief Harms? Do you have anything to add to that?
No, we were. Like Brad said, we had 6 different policies that we're bringing forward, and these 2 policies that are our action items here are 2 of the largest ones. And they've done for, I think, 3 years now, have gone out and shopped for us for the best policies and the best coverage for the district. Our recommendation is that we accept this recommendation.
All right. Thank you, Chief Harms. Questions or comments from the board?
Mr. Chair, I make a motion we
I
adopt.
have a question, just one question.
Okay. Director Gale.
Your ethics on Wells Fargo, have you done anything to correct that? Because I was at a meeting and it was brought up, and this organization had decided to maybe switch their finances to some other place.
Yeah, so I'm on the insurance side of things, and I'm still part of Wells Fargo. Obviously was not a positive thing. Wells Fargo bought our agency back in 2001. It was Accordia prior to that, and I think we're 1 or 2% of Wells Fargo's world, so to speak. Yeah, I don't know what to say. I really feel bad about it. It didn't impact my world because I can't imagine signing up someone for an extra insurance policy. I can't even get my clients to pay their regular policy. So anyway, I apologize for the company.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I appreciate that, as that doesn't fall on your shoulders.
Of course. Right.
But we appreciate you saying that as well, so.
When Grant has a chance to
And I want to
finish
say,
his second.
yeah, and moving the proposal forward is that I want to thank your organization for the fine work that they're doing at saving us money.
Right.
It's a rarity that insurance policies go down, at least our cost. And so I want to thank you for the hard work that you're all doing, particularly for some of the challenges that we have in ensuring some of the work that we do. So thank you for that effort.
Yep.
Thank you very
And
much.
my motion stands.
Okay, we have a motion, and we have a second. Madam Clerk.
Dr. Gale,
Yes.
Gould,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Sheets,
Aye.
Clark,
Aye.
Kelly,
Aye.
and Barnes.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay, thank you. Don't go too far. All right, we're going to action item number 4, disclosure of material expenditure, commercial insurance. And Brad is Svenningson, right?
Yeah, correct.
Got it, second
Good
time.
job.
Good.
Good job.
Don't ask another one, I'll mess it up. So, but thank you. Cheers. Go ahead.
Yeah, this policy is it's your main, in our industry, you call your package policy. It's your commercial auto and your property and your liability and such. And you're with SDRMA, and you've been with them for about 10 years now. This is the one policy that the premium did go up, went up about 17% or $78,000. So cut into that savings on the excess workers' comp. The next closest company I have is at north of $750,000, and I was thankful. Seems weird that we did get an increase from SDRMA because you're running about 80% loss ratio, and we need to protect that relationship and make sure they're happy as we go through this process. So that's my thought process on that. Great company. Everything's been going well from our end, and I believe your end. But anyway, that's
one of the things that was identified by staff was that the amount of vehicles that we have has increased. And one of the strategies is to look at vehicles, look at excess vehicles, and remove those vehicles as surplus, which will have a little bit of an income, but it will have a decrease in the amount of the policy then. So they're going through that and looking at vehicles and mileage and usage at this time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Director
Chief,
Gould.
might that have something to do with the fact that our call volume continues to go up?
It was the call volume, it was the amount of claims that we had, but a big thing was the amount of vehicles and the amount of sedans that we have in the fleet. And looking at those, looking at some pool cars and removing some of the vehicles will make a difference. But yes, that and our accidents.
Mr. Chair, I make a recommendation, we adopt staff's recommendation.
We have a motion?
Second.
And a second. Madam Clerk.
Dr. Gale,
Yes.
Gould,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Sheets,
Aye.
Clark,
Aye.
Kelly,
Aye.
and Barnes.
Aye. Thank
Motion
you very-
passes.
Sorry. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate all you do for us.
thanks.
Moving on to action item number 5, industrial disability retirement. Frank Lima, HR Manager, Melissa Maddox.
Good evening, directors, Chief Harms. I'm Melissa Maddox, the HR Manager here at Metro Fire. The resolutions that we're bringing to you tonight were already approved for industrial disability retirements for 2 employees and were adopted by the board on April 27, 2017, and those were subsequently submitted to CalPERS for processing. The district was then notified by CalPERS that they had new language that they wanted in the resolutions, and any resolutions that we might submit in the future, so they wanted us to redo them. We made the required revisions, and those revisions included a statement certifying that the determination was not used as a substitution for the disciplinary process. Also, a statement confirming the member had filed a workers' comp claim and that claim was accepted. Also, a statement documenting the member's last day on payroll, which is different than their actual effective retirement date. The statement not only identifying the disabling condition as we had in the past, but now they actually want us to identify the body part or parts that are injured. And a statement that the disability is permanent or will last at least 12 consecutive months. And then lastly, the resolutions they want signed by the board president. We sent CalPERS the draft resolution after we implemented all those changes, and they approved it. So I'm bringing these resolutions back to the board tonight to adopt the resolutions in the new format. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any questions or comments from the board? The only question I would have, is this like an industry standard where their CalPERS is now going to require this part moving forward on this language, or is it just for these two particular?
No, it applies to all public agencies, okay. And we were notified by a circular, that a 6-page circular that took us a little bit of time to get through and figure out exactly what they were asking us to do, but we were working with CalPERS directly, and it applies to all public agencies, particularly in safety, where the board is able to adopt IDRs. And because with the miscellaneous members, CalPERS determines that disability.
All right. Thank you very much. No questions? Can I get a motion for action item number 5?
Mr. Chair, I make a motion that we adopt staff's recommendation on this IDR revise.
I have a motion.
Make a second.
I have a second. Madam Clerk.
Dr. Gale,
Yes.
Gould,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Sheets,
Aye.
Clark, Kelly,
Aye.
and Barnes.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And it's the same, I would imagine it was the same language for action item number 6 as well, correct? Mm-hmm. So action item number 6, industrial disability retirement for Philip Lopez.
Mr. Chair, I make a motion that we adopt that recommendation.
I second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second, Madam Clerk.
Dr. Gale,
Yes.
Gould,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Sheets,
Aye.
Clark,
Aye.
Kelly,
Aye.
and Barnes.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to the reports, President's reports. I do not have anything at this point. So moving on to Fire Chief report, Chief Harms.
Thank you, sir. Directors, wildland season was declared on May 17th at 0800 hours. Myself and AC Wagman were sitting this afternoon, and after the rain this morning, to our surprise, we had a pretty significant little wildfire that took off this afternoon down by 58. And it just shows how quick that grass has dried out, and that the fuel is there, and with a little bit of wind, even with the rains this morning, we had a significant little fire this morning, or this afternoon. A couple new hires. We have an office tech. Roman Cleats is at the logistics division. One of our firefighters, Drew Cogden, had a off-duty hand injury that was, for him, would have been career-ending. We were able to work with him, and he has started as a Fire Inspector 1. I actually saw him out in front of the building, and it was one of those times that everything fell in place for us to be able to find a position within the district for him to continue being here. And he's happy as could be, and I saw him with one of the other inspectors out front doing some training earlier. Shay Purcell, effective on the 19th, is now our fleet manager. He's been with the district well before since the district began, and even before that. Was moved up out of class down there for a period of time, and has done an outstanding job and did very well in the interview process and moving forward then. Myself, I finished up the fire chief's forms. They were very productive. We'll do those again in October. And we had a very productive meeting with 522 last week, which is our standing monthly meeting, and talked about kind of our standing agenda items. We went over and played in Citrus Heights PD, and Metro Fire played in a basketball game against the San Juan Spartans. PD and Fire did beat up on the young kids that were out there. I guess that was okay. And the police chief did beat me in free throws, and so we'll do better next year on that one there.
Chief?
Tomorrow, I know. Tomorrow at 6 p.m. at the Rancho Cordova City Hall is the Fire Academy graduation. And also on Monday, we started a new SRP academy with 8 members in that academy. That is all that I have at that time, unless you have some questions.
Thank you, Chief Harms. Any questions? Operations report, Assistant Chief Wagner.
Good evening, Directors, Fire Chief Harms, Madam Clerk, and constituents. Tyler Wagaman, Assistant Chief Operations, standing in for Chief Bridge this evening. I appreciate the installation of the lower mic. On to our ops report. Since May 11th, Metro Fires responded to 8,041 calls. Of those, 19 of which were structure fires. 5,691 EMS calls with a transport rate of 69.4%. Our partners at AMR were dispatched to 776 dispatches with a transport rate of 57.2%. Year to date, 54% of our patients were transported with advanced life support, while the balance 46% were basic life support. Now I'll provide you a brief update on our fire station thefts. As I'm sure most of you are aware, there's been a significant break in our fire station theft cases, which actually dates back to April 1st. On June 5th, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, in conjunction with our arson investigators, arrested Lonnie Scott Schaefer, 28 years old, out of Sacramento, in connection with a fire station theft at Station 29, which was our last burglary. To date, there has been no less than 13 thefts at our fire stations, as well as one in the Sacramento City Fire Department and one in Roseville. The majority of these thefts were items, power tool items, things of that nature, from not only sheds at fire stations, but from apparatus parked inside of our fire stations. As you can imagine, this placed our members on edge, to say the least, as well as our citizens at risk. The men and women of Metro Fire and our fellow citizens can rest a little easier, knowing now that there has been associated arrest in these cases. Sincere thank you to our members of Metro Fire for their high level of vigilance, their documentation, and their evidence preservation, as well as our partnership with the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department and their continued commitment towards these investigations. I would like to add, though, that these incidents are still under thorough investigation, and we hope to bring you some additional details as they're brought forward. That concludes my operations report, unless you have any questions for me.
Thank you, Chief Wagaman. Any questions or comments?
Thank you
very much. Appreciate it. Firefighter Local 522. Do we have anybody here tonight?
522 doesn't have any report tonight.
Okay, thank you very much. Committee and delegate reports. Executive committee has not met, and we do not have a date and time set for our next meeting. Communications Center, JPA, Assistant Chief Johnson.
Good evening, Director, Chief Harms. Our last meeting was on May 25th. A couple items of significance for you. The lease of one of the district properties was approved at that meeting, as well as a preliminary budget. Our next meeting is going to be on June 27th at 9 a.m. right here in this chambers.
Thank you very much. California Fire Recruiting Training, JPA, Director Kelly.
Yes, the JPA has not met since I last reported out. We have a meeting scheduled for Thursday of next week here at the SESC.
Thank you very much. Finance and Audit Committee, back up again, Director Kelly.
Yes, the Finance and Audit Committee will meet Thursday the 22nd, and other members of that committee, we should confer later this evening and determine what time we wish to meet.
I don't know, are you going to be there, or am I going to have to do it again?
22nd? It's a long ways from now. I can't tell you.
I've got notes. I practiced.
All right, very good. Thank you very much. And Policy Committee, Director Gould.
Policy Committee will be having a soiree on July 13th, 2017.
Thank you very much. We'll be moving on to board members' questions and comments, then shortly after that into closed session. So starting off, board member comments. Director Kelly, if you would.
I would like to thank Ms. Thomas for the work that she did on the preliminary budget and her staff. I would also like to welcome the single role program participants and wish them luck in their effort. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Director Clark.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to thank our finance division for the great job they're doing, and thank you for helping us understand this budget sometimes. You do a great job explaining it. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Clark. And Director Sheets.
No comment.
Okay. Thank you, Director Gale.
I attended the Wood Avenue Property and Business Improvement District meeting today, and kudos to the finance department. Great job, tremendous job you've done. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Gale. And Director, I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. And Director Gould.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today I received a heartwarming email from a constituent in our community, and it was a really unique story where she explained that she was in a bit of a challenge with one of her family members that happens to be of the four-legged variety. And she was very distraught, and she didn't know where to go and turn to, and the animal was, it appears to be passing away, and she was pretty distraught. And she reached out to other public servants who couldn't come to her aid. So our dispatchers, critically thinking, talked to a supervisor, as she explained it in her email, and they made a decision that they would contact the crews directly in a non-emergent fashion, but come to her aid. And it was just really heartwarming to listen to her talk about the firefighters and how they respected that family member for this senior citizen. And it was just really a heartwarming, non-fire, non-EMS based story. And it just really, again, articulates how the men and women of this agency will go to the aid of people in our community, even when it's not expected and not normal. But they will do those things that make this person, the way I read it, was it changed her day. And it made her recognize, and she went on to give us significant kudos. So I don't know any more details than that, but I just want to thank the dispatchers who recognized how distraught she was and how important it was to her and took the time to make sure that our services were rendered in an appropriate fashion. And I just want to thank them, because these are the kinds of things that probably won't make the news, or we won't have some kind of a plaque for that individual. But everybody really showed up, and I'm grateful. Having a mother that's of age, and I think she loves her cat more than probably me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Director Gould, and I would agree with you on that one.
What about my mother loving the cat?
Yes,
really?
sir.
Just an analogy.
Oh, okay. Director Jones.
Okay. Disregarding the last few comments, thank you very much, Director Gould, for a very touching story. And the Assist the Citizens calls often do go unnoticed, but they carry a lot of weight and a lot of positive vibes for Metro Fire out to the community. And I would just echo all the other positive comments that my fellow directors have made.
Right. Thank you, Director Jones. The only thing I have, in addition to everything, again, the presentation tonight, again, it shows that we're forward thinking and preparing for the future, hoping for the best, expecting for the worst, threat assessments and budget. So I appreciate all that. One thing it was challenged, was thrown out, I believe, by President Wood and everybody else, and I think it was Ty Bailey at 5 to 2 about the Tropical Affair that is coming up on the 24th of June. I bought my tickets and bringing some friends as well, but it'll be the 24th, 6 p.m. to 10 at Shriners Hospital. So it'll be my first time going. I'm looking forward to it. So that's all I have. With that, we'll be moving into closed session. So everybody in attendance, as Director Gould used to always say, have a good night, and hopefully don't see anybody when we come back out. Director Gale, are you stepping out or are you coming back? Because we have to report out on this before we close. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Director Barnes. The board met in closed session to consider the property damage claim under Government Code Section 910 of Orville, Miller, Ochoa. The board, by unanimous decision, decided to direct the clerk to reject that claim.
Thank you, Council Oliver. If there's nothing else, meeting adjourned. Thank you very much.
Preliminary budget, we're out of here in an hour.